And now to part two of our continuing discussion of the Manson case, 50 years on. We just heard from Al Wyman, and this video continues now with Ivar Davis.
Ivar Davis's great book, Manson Exposed, which I highly recommend to you and is for sale here. The chapter that really struck me in there was Spahn Ranch. And the reason for that is that you wound up spending multiple days there. And you got to know the characters, warts and all, including Old Man Spahn. And I'm wondering if you could talk about that experience.
Can you all hear me back in the cheap seats there? Okay, thank you for that question. I have a couple of housekeeping announcements.
Please.
One, I want to thank you and Joel and this incredible crew that you have for bringing us all together. So thank you again for that. Now, the other thing is that you may notice that 50 years have elapsed since it happened. And I look around at Sandy, Linda, Bill, and Al, and believe it or not, you've hardly changed. Although, Al, I just watched the film, you've changed a bit.
My head grew up through my hair.
Thank you. Anyway, I forget what so that was it. What was the question again? No, the Spahn Ranch.
The question was about Spahn Ranch.
Spahn Ranch. Well,
because you spent several days there
yeah.
and reported it extensively in your book,
yeah.
and you met all these folks, and tell us how that came about.
Okay, so, I mean, basically I was a reporter working for the London Daily Express, and I was out at the house, as Linda was, on the case right away. As soon as we heard about Manson being arrested, I raced up to Inyo County, where he was, he says he was 5'5". He claims to Diane Sawyer, but he was 5'2". I digress. Back to the Spahn Ranch. Oh, by the way, where the hell were you, Wendy, with those pictures when I wrote my book?
I think I was 6 years old.
Okay. Back at the Spahn Ranch. I know we have a limited time. So we knew about Manson, and so I raced out to the Spahn Ranch and met Brooks Poston, Paul Watkins, and several members of the Spahn Ranch who were not involved with the murders. I expected to find hostility. There was a little bit of hostility from Sandra Good, also not involved, and Squeaky Frome, or Frommy. And by the way, Squeaky Frommy knew me, and when I came to court on the first day, she threatened to stick a knife down my throat. Back to the Spahn Ranch. Sorry. Back to the Spahn Ranch. Well, I got there expecting hostility, but I got an outpouring of unbelievable stuff from these guys. I mean, I sat there and they said, Charlie Manson gave us drugs, and Charlie Manson said to us, the Beatles' White Album has songs on it, Helter Skelter, Revolution, Piggies, and we knew from Charlie that this was a message to us that there was going to be a black-white revolution because the Beatles told us. I mean, I thought, what a bunch of utter claptrap. Because I knew the Beatles, I traveled with the Beatles, but I wasn't about to say, you're full of shit. I mean, you know, you go out for the story. I met George Spahn as well. If those of you who have seen the movie, the Quentin Tarantino movie, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, will know it's a great movie, but it's a Grimm's fairy tale.
Not a great movie.
Well, it's a great movie, Linda, if you want to know the atmosphere for 69, the music, the ambiance, the LA setting. And anyway, the point is that the Spahn Ranch, George Spahn, wasn't quite as zonked out in the as he was shown in the movie. So I got this story, wrote it, and nobody believed it except Vincent Bugliosi, and the rest, as they say, is history.
Thank you.
Wow.
Thanks, Ivar. And again, his book is available for sale. I hope you will take advantage and buy it. It's an absolutely great read. Contained a lot of information, A, I didn't know, and B, I'd forgotten about. Next up, Bill Robles. And Bill is going to take us through 14 of his graphics, and there's so many of them, but he is an artist like no other. And at the time of the trial, he was working for what was then KNXT Channel 2 and for CBS News. And Bill, I'm going to go through these and kind of on your cue and tell us about them.
Well, we all know who this is. I had never set foot into a courtroom in my whole life. And all of a sudden, other than Perry Mason on TV, I was thrust into this worldwide famous trial. And it was an experience and a half, meeting media from New York and all over the world. This is an overall shot with Manson in the background with the girls. We were sitting almost within touching distance of the girls, and all they did was gossip throughout the whole trial. Yak, 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 yak. Manson took the witness stand once. Remember that, Linda?
Sure do.
Yeah.
Never forget it.
Yeah, which was actually, people were terrified of him when the trial started, as I was. But as the trial wore on, I could see the compassion that he had. I mean, why the women were attracted to him, because he had kind of a compassionate way about him. And I was one of the only ones that felt that, but I could see how they followed him. This is a shot of Manson fiddling with his hair. It was a quick moment that I had to get with Ron Hughes.
This is my favorite of all of them. And,
This
and tell us
drawing-
about the circumstances here.
I think it was, they tried to get a mistrial by slipping Manson the newspaper that he held up to show the jury. And Dave Shin, I believe, is the one that slipped it to him. This led with the Walter Cronkite News that evening, this drawing. So that was kind of well. Here's Vincent Bugliosi with Judge Older in the background. Fascinating guy. I think if he would have prosecuted O.J., we might have had a different result. But, no, you don't think so? This also was a startling moment. We had to freeze in time. There were 7 artists at that trial. Every TV station in those days had their own artists, and I was working for CBS News at that time. Manson, I think he, correct me if I'm wrong, he said, somebody ought to cut your head off, Joe.
I said somebody should cut your head off, old man.
Old man. And he leaped toward the judge, and the bailiff tackled him in midair. That also led with the Walter Cronkite News that evening. It was a huge, huge story. This is Manson mid-trial, where he took on almost a 1950s look. And he went through various changes, which kept things interesting. He had a blue scarf there and a goatee with long hair. Well, it was not as long as it was originally, but here are the girls that did everything he did. They shaved their heads, and there's Manson in the background. You can see the bailiff who appears in a lot of the photographs that we've seen today, yeah. And they did everything he did. This is Dave Shin with the girls with their shaved heads. And this is Manson's attorney, Irving Kinerick, who was quite a character. I mean, he had the pants that were like 3 inches too long at the shoe level. And, but he was quite a character, quite a character. The court reporters are interesting guys as well to do. 2 males. Manson with his shaved head again with the start of it. I guess he has the swastika at that point, as did the girls, although they didn't do the swastikas, they just left the X's. And this is a shot of the jury. Second from the right is the gentleman that appeared on her photographs, the jury foreman. There was no air conditioning in those days. They had that huge circulating fan that stood up. And I don't think anybody complained about the heat in those days. And this is the finale. It was a sketch of the judge from my drawing pad. I couldn't resist to throw in some humor. So anyway, that kind of ended the whole thing. But pretty fascinating.
So, Bill, I'm wondering about the mechanics of it. You had a sketch pad, obviously, in the courtroom. How much of the work did you do in the courtroom, and how much of it was left to finish in time to have your artwork face the cameras
You know what,
outside?
in those days, they had film. They used to send out, the news people would send out the film to processing labs, and they would wait for the film to be processed and then come back to the station, so there was time to work on the drawings at that time. Now it's a whole different thing. They take the drawing, put it on the truck, and it's on the satellite just like that before you know it. But it was fascinating.
How much did you complete in the courtroom, and how much back outside?
There was very little back outside.
It was almost all done in the courtroom.
Yeah,
Yeah, in color.
yeah. Usually you put the color on the outside because they clear the courtrooms during the breaks or during the the recess. Yeah.
Bill's book is for sale, $50, right? It's absolutely worth it.
The work
it's a
is
treasure.
of many artists around the country, and the work that's in the book, including mine, was purchased by the Library of Congress 2 years ago. So that art is very historic.
Thank you, Bill. So, Linda Deutsch, can I ask you one question before we go on to the main thing here?
Sure.
It just occurs to me, with Manson on the stand, obviously we didn't see it because it wasn't on television. What was his demeanor like?
Well, Charlie was a showman. He was used to holding court with his family, and any time he could in the courtroom, he put on a show. Whether it was telling the girls what to do or yelling at the judge, there were days when all of them had to be taken out of the courtroom because they were acting up and singing. He sang in court, which was not a great treat. And they would have to listen from an adjoining room. He was a constant, he made himself the center of attention. Before we go forward, though, I have to tell you, I am so impressed with Bill's work. I didn't know that was his first trial.
Yours too.
Well, no, I had done the Sirhan trial, but for Bill to be able to come in, watching him work in the courtroom is an education for any artist, because he had to work so fast, and the details are so incredible. And to imagine now a trial where there were no cameras allowed, and the only record of what happened were his drawings, it's just absolutely incredible.
Let me take you to another subject, Linda. It's Leslie Van Houten. Some of you are not aware that Leslie...
Oh, wait a minute. I have to tell you one last
Okay,
story.
then
I'm
we'll get to
sorry.
Leslie.
You were talking about Charlie, and Bill said how people were afraid of him at the beginning. Well, we sat very close to him, and we thought he was just kind of, a showman. He was putting on a show, and one day, Sandy and our friend Theo Wilson, who was the dean of the press corps, and Mary Neiswender were sitting in the front row in our usual seats, and Charlie turned around and he said, "Your karma is coming down on you. It's going to be bad." And Theo, who really was quite a character herself, turned to him and she said, "Oh, shut up, Charlie." And that became famous. Because later she said, "I guess I shouldn't be telling a defendant to shut up, but I couldn't help it." So we were not that impressed with Charlie's, his delivery.
Let me take you to Leslie Van Houten. She's incarcerated in Chino. You may not know, and you're about to find out, that since her retirement, Linda has been in frequent contact with Leslie. And I want to show you a piece done very recently, again by our friends at KABC, which outlines this, and then I'll ask Linda to talk about it personally. And here's that report coming up for you now.
It was something that no one else could experience who hadn't been there. It was so life-altering in many ways, because you saw a side of humanity that you didn't think existed.
Linda Deutsch was a legendary Associated Press reporter. The Charles Manson trial was her first big assignment. She recalls when the murders happened in August of 1969. People suddenly started to lock their doors and fear what was outside. That summer of love died a very fast death.
There was no more Let the Sun Shine In. It was now horror and violence and killing.
Deutsch went on to become one of the most respected journalists in Los Angeles history. And by the end of her long career, the Manson trial was one of many huge stories she's covered. But then, something spectacularly unexpected happened.
A couple of years ago, I retired. And I got a call from Leslie's lawyer, and she asked if Leslie could write me a letter.
Leslie was Leslie Van Houten, one of Manson's infamous murderers. And during the trial, the 19-year-old's wholesome, attractive looks were a contradiction to the horrible acts that she committed, admitting to stabbing Rosemary LaBianca 14 times.
I cannot tell you how pleased I am that you are comfortable hearing from me.
5 decades later, the Leslie that Linda would come to know was very different.
She wrote me the most beautiful letter thanking me for being fair to her all these years. She said that the coverage I had given her was not always something she liked. She said it often stung, but she said it should. I had to face what I had done.
The letter would open the door for Linda to visit Leslie in prison.
We have so much to talk about. And it's not just the killings and the trial, but it was about how she has been transformed.
How do I live out the rest of my life in here and be able to say it wasn't a wasted life?
She wrote an incredible master's thesis, which I have read. She took courses in counseling so she could help other women who were in the same situation she was.
Now that Deutsch has gotten to know Van Houten, she believes that she should be paroled. She served her time.
She said to me once, you know, she said, I could not have lived if I didn't pay for what I did. But she said, I never thought I'd have to pay for this long.
Linda, I wonder if you could tell us if there's any possibility in your mind that she will be paroled.
Oh, I think there is. She has already been approved 3 times by the parole boards, who said that she is the most rehabilitated prisoner that ever was. She has certainly found redemption in her own soul for this. And we've talked about it a great deal. And she said that, I said, why do you even want to keep trying to do this? Because it's a huge effort. And each time she goes before the board, it's draining, it's tough. She has to be confronted again with all the facts of the killings. But she said, if I don't keep trying, then I have no hope, and I can't live without hope. But she has said things to me that, you know, make it clear that she has remorse. There's no question about that. And she would like to help others. Recently, I went to see her 2 weeks ago. I go to see her at Chino, and we sit in a room with other prisoners. They have a community room where you can sit and have a drink and talk. And she said, you know, I'm working so hard out here because they've now made her the ombudsman between prisoners and the people that run the prison. She hears their complaints. They come and talk to her, tell her what's going on. She goes back to the authorities and explains it all and tries to get resolutions. She's really working for the prison. And she said, you know, I'm old. I should at least be semi-retired. She said, but they don't give us retirement here in prison. She's kind of funny. And she faces the possibility that she may never get out, but her lawyer doesn't face that because her sentence was changed to life imprisonment. Her whole case was different because she was not present at the Tate home. She was present at the LaBianca home. You know, she was out because her lawyer disappeared during the Manson trial, and her conviction was overturned. So she was out on parole for a time, on probation, or on bail. She was out on bail for about a year while she was awaiting a second trial, and she did fine. And then she had the second trial, at which Maxwell Keith argued that she had been brainwashed, and there was a hung jury. And then there was a third trial, and at the third trial she was convicted. But, you know, she was ready to serve her time. She has seen women come and go from that prison she's been in 50 years. She has seen women come and go who did worse than she did, and they get out. And so her new appeal will probably go to the appeals court in October, and it will argue that she is being discriminated against because of her notoriety and because of Manson's notoriety. The only reason she hasn't been released is because of the name Manson. And I remember one time I was out there I covered all her parole hearings. The reason that we have nothing we have to explain to each other, because I've been there for the whole thing, for the trial, for the parole hearings, for the hearings for her, the other defendants, for Charlie. And this deputy walked up to me as I was leaving one of the parole hearings, and he said to me, you know, she should be out, and you know the reason she's not. And I said, what? And he said, you, the press, you're the reason she's not out. And I kind of agree, because it's only the notoriety that has kept her in there. Don't ask me about the other defendants, because I'm not as adamant about them. But Leslie was 19 when this happened. She was, you know, a pillar of her community until she got involved with drugs and a boy, and then with Charlie. And it was tragic, but she certainly has, still has the impetus to help others, and I think she should be allowed to do that. She said she thinks that she and the others should be studied. How did this nice girl from a nice family in Monrovia get into this? She still wonders about it.
Sorry, can I interrupt a second?
Here's
Out
Micah.
of line. Every time, you've been to the parole hearings, and I agree with you about Leslie, because she was not involved in the Manson murders at all. She was tarred by that awful night. But every time the parole hearings, and you've been there have been people testifying against releasing her, saying, why should we show her mercy when she showed no mercy whatsoever to the LaBiancas? So, I mean, how do you counter that?
Well, that can be said about any murder defendant. Any murder defendant. They all have families. They all have victims, but nobody says it about them. It's because she's so famous, and I'm convinced that's the only reason. I wrote a piece for the LA Times op-ed page 3 years ago on why she should be released. And I had hoped that Governor Brown would approve it. The only reason she doesn't get out on these recommendations is because the governor won't approve it. Brown rejected it 3 times, and now Newsom has said he's worried about her potential for violence. The woman is 70 years old and has been in prison for 50 years. She has no potential for violence. It's an excuse, because he doesn't want to be known as the governor who let a Manson person out. Now, Squeaky is out, and Sandy Good is out. Squeaky tried to assassinate a president, but it just didn't work the same because it was federal court. And other members of the Manson family have gotten out without any attention. Steve Grogan, known as Clem in the family, got out long ago, and he was involved in the killing of Gary Hinman. So it's very different because their trial was so famous, and because Charlie was the symbol of evil. I thought that when Charlie died, that would be the end of it. And now Leslie could get out. But it's as if the curse of Manson still hangs over everything.
Thanks, Linda. Sandy, I'd like to ask you and Linda a question and have you go first. Both of you were working for wire services at the time. City News for you, and of course the Associated Press for Linda. During the first 48 hours or so of the story breaking of the Tate murders. How difficult was it, and what were your standards in trying to quickly turn around this story, number one? Number two, separating the very few facts available during those 48 hours from a whole ton of speculation. How did you do it?
It was difficult because the Los Angeles Police Department, for the first 48 hours and sometime after that, kept insisting that the LaBianca murders were copycat murders. And in later years, I had a friend who was a homicide detective who worked on the Hinman case. And Gary Hinman was a musician who was murdered in Topanga Canyon just prior to the Tate murders. And he said that as soon as they read about the Tate murders or heard about the Tate murders, they called LAPD and said, it looks like we've got some similarities between our murder and your murders. And the words he used was, they told me to go pound sand. And so it was very difficult. We were all running around like a chicken with our heads cut off because we did not know. The only thing that we knew was that this was a very high celebrity case. The LaBianca murders were called copycat murders, so we were focusing, of course, on the Tate murders. Roman Polanski came back from England, I believe, and held a news conference, which I was there, most of us were there. And it was just the most broken-hearted person that I've ever seen in my life, which turned out to be a little odd because in later years when I was with the DA's office, I was defending the DA's office prosecution of him and trying to get him back from Europe because of the conviction that he had in Santa Monica when he pleaded guilty to unlawful sex with a minor. But so there wasn't a lot that we could go on. One of the first things that my office did was to send me to interview Peter Hurkos, who was a very famous psychic. A very weird interview. It was, I mean, we're talking serious weird. We went to the I met him at the Brown Derby in Hollywood, and he had a publicist with him. We had lunch. He did not speak to me directly. I had to ask and we were all sitting together. I had to ask the publicist the question. The publicist then asked him the question. He would give the publicist the answer, and she would give me the answer, which was, since I was a note taker, I didn't have a tape recorder, it worked out well because I could get every word. But it turned out that he was absolutely no help at all. He had no idea or any psychic vibrations about who the killers were. But the confusion, I think, among the media, at least for my wire service, because we just didn't have a clue as to who these people were.
Linda, I wonder if you can give us a quick response to that. And then Sandy, I've got another question for you.
Okay. Also, I neglected to say one thing in response to Ira's question, which is that Leslie has not been sentenced to life without parole. She is life, and that the parole, she was eligible at 25 years. So the law really requires that she be released. The day of the Sharon Tate killings, I was in Orange County at the airport meeting President Nixon, who was coming in to see his new Western White House. And we had a situation at the wires then which was called touchdown duty, which was that a young reporter who wasn't, at the top would be assigned to go to an airport when the president's plane landed and just call and say he arrived safely. That was my assignment. So I got there, he arrived, it was August 9th, and the symmetry is unbelievable because 5 years later on August 9th he resigned. But so I called in and I said, the president's here, and they said, forget the president. There's a much bigger story. There's been a mass murder in Beverly Hills. Get in here as fast as you can. So I went tearing into the office in my little VW Bug and listening to the radio about what had happened. And I was the perfect person for this story because I was a Hollywood expert. And I knew who Sharon Tate was. I knew who Roman Polanski was. I got to the office and I began taking dictation from our reporter who had gone to the scene. And my name is on the very first story because I've been looking at the archives. And the first Wire story has my byline on it. I worked all through that day, and at midnight, the City Newswire, which we watched constantly, jumped to life and said there have been 2 more bodies found in Los Feliz. And that was the LaBiancas. And I remember screaming across the newsroom, "Oh my God, it's happened again." And at that point, nobody knew if it was a copycat or it was these crazed mass murderers running around the city. That added to the fear. But right away, there was no clue to who did this. And it took 3 months before they found out who did it. So during that period, as Sandy said, you had to do all kinds of stories. Mine was to go and interview the head of a satanic church who was known as Morlock the Warlock. And Morlock had been accused, basically. People were pointing a finger at him and saying maybe his followers did this. Morlock received me and said he had nothing to do with it. And that was the end of that. But I can't tell you the number of people that we interviewed during that interim period. And then when we got word that this strange cult had been found up in the high desert and they were bringing in Manson, we were there. Sandy and I were standing next to each other in the hallway when he was brought out in his buckskin outfit. The cameras were allowed in the hallway, believe it or not, all the camera crews. It was a mob scene. And when Manson came this way, they went that way. And they were running so fast that they pushed a water fountain out of the wall, and the whole hallway was flooded with water. And I looked at Sandy and I said, "This is crazy." And I thought, it can't continue like this, but it did. It was even crazier later on.
You know, I must just add, I'm sorry, because in a way, we, the media, were a bit to blame for the madness after the Sharon Tate murders. I, like Linda, was there on the first day at the house, but the stories that emanated following the murders were outrageous.
Oh yeah, they were accusing Polanski.
Well, Roman Polanski made a movie called Rosemary's Baby. You may remember it. Basically what happened is Mia Farrow was impregnated by the devil. So they said, oh my God, this crazy man Polanski, his wife's been murdered in horrific fashion. There's got to be something there. He has his fingerprints on the death of his pregnant wife.
I have to say a lot of that came out of England.
Okay, well, but let me tell you, those English can be crazy.
I know.
Not all of them,
Not
but
you,
not
but-
all. Oh, of course not.
Yeah,
No, come on.
I think, Al, you want to add something?
You spent so much time up at the Spahn Ranch. Who was in charge up there?
Well, there was nobody in charge. I went there on December the 3rd after Charlie had been arraigned up at Inyo County because I thought, what the hell was going on here? And when I got there, I wandered around at this smelly pit of a movie ranch, which was on its last legs, wasn't it? I mean, it was no longer used by porn movie makers, no longer by Hollywood. So I got there, and the place was, nobody was in charge. I met Squeaky, and as Linda pointed out, this is the same Squeaky who became famous because she tried to kill Gerald Ford.
Did you meet Gypsy?
Gypsy was not there. I met Sandra Good, I met Brooks Poston, Paul Watkins, many of the other guys, and they were all not involved with the murders. And Squeaky did not want to talk to me. She said, oh, Charlie is so wonderful about the environment, good guy. I thought, oh my God, I'm going to get a negative story. And then I sat down with Brooks Poston. I don't know if you remember Brooks, I think you had him on the film. And Paul Watkins, two guys, and they spun this unbelievable story.
But every time we went up there, it was Gypsy who was the person in charge. And if we wanted to talk to somebody, Gypsy was the person that said, you can talk to so-and-so or so-and-so. And whatever happened to Catherine Scher, Gypsy?
I talked to her a few years ago on one of the anniversaries. She's living an upright life. She has a child. She said to me, you know, if I had never met Charlie, I might be doing what you're doing now. She's very intelligent. She came down, she testified at a hearing for Leslie, actually, last year. She doesn't let her picture be taken because she doesn't want to be recognized, but she was smart. She said that but she did say in the interview I did with her that the only reason she didn't go to the Tate House was that Charlie wouldn't let her go because he thought she was too fat and she wouldn't fit through windows.
Oh. Sandy,
about
you had
fate.
Sandy, you had a thought on this.
The number 2 person in the Klan at the time was Bruce Davison. And of course, Bruce got into the wind after Charlie was arrested, did not surrender until after the trial was in progress. Gypsy was probably one of the strongest of the girls. When I went out to the ranch, she wasn't out there when I went out there also. I went and rode horses around in the back country for a while just to see what it was like, find some witchy things hanging from trees and stuff. But the people that I talked to the most were Sandy Good and Squeaky. And Squeaky was the one who actually took care of George Spahn. She'd walk him around, and when I was out there, he was wandering around in the yard and or on the compound, and Squeaky was leading him around. Sandy Good was very articulate, and she was talking about you know, how if they wanted something, they just think about it and it would happen. So there was a hierarchy, but among the girls, Gypsy was the strongest one, and I think she was the leader. And I didn't think she was that fat.
She wasn't. She wasn't. But she had also been trained as a classical violinist.
Ah.
I mean, a lot of these girls came from incredible families. Sandy Good, who was beautiful, she was the blonde with the big blue eyes. Theo said she looked like an astronaut's wife. She once said to me, I said, well, you know, how do your parents feel about you being with Charlie and all? She said, oh, my mother wanted me to marry a doctor or a lawyer or a senator. That was the kind of family she came from. And she actually had been fixed up on a blind date once with Stephen Kay, who was the prosecutor in the case.
Steve Kay's mother was a journalist. She was, and she knew the Good family quite well, or Sandy Good's parents quite well. And the two mothers fixed up Sandy Kay.
Sandy, can I ask you one question?
Sure.
This will be the last one I have, and then I'm going to open it up, so get your questions and comments ready. So many of the people in this room who covered affairs involving the district attorney. Hello there, grandsons of Italy. People like Dave Lopez and so many other people in this room knew you best as the spokesperson for the LADA. My question is, from the Manson case, and for that matter, from the Sirhan case, and all the legal cases that you covered, what takeaways did you take from those trials into your experience as a spokesperson for the DA?
I learned in covering trials that the people that got the best press were the people that talked to the media. And that was defense attorneys. Prosecutors very rarely would talk to reporters or treat them with a lot of disdain. So from day one, when I joined the DA's office, I tried to encourage my folks in the DA's office to talk to the media. You don't have to tell them big secrets, but you don't have to, slam the door in their faces either. I also felt that part of my job was to help the media understand how courts are covered, how the process goes, how the DA's office works. If they had a question on trying to find something, I would help them find something. I think that the early clip that she showed with David Ono and Al, that was me going through the evidence with the film crew. I did that a lot, and I felt that it made my office more understandable to you guys.
When I came out in February for some interviews about the 50th anniversary of Eyewitness and about this, they took us in the room, but now, how many boxes of evidence were there?
There were over 30.
Well, they told us there were 50. They let us see the boxes, but they wouldn't open any of the boxes. They wouldn't let us look inside.
I think
because you were gone.
That's right. That's right.
That's the reason we didn't get to see it.
I'm sorry.
But in the same room, I have to tell you a little secret. In the same room where they're storing the Manson evidence, the 50 boxes, there are 3 boxes marked Marilyn Monroe.
There was also, the first time I went into that room, there was a guy named Muhammad Kurbegovic, who many of you remember, the bomber. And
Alphabet bomb.
They had a couple of boxes of evidence from that trial. And I looked through it, and I told one of the investigators, I said, well, there's all this stuff that might explode in here. And they said, oh my God. And they finally separated the evidence. The whole thing could have gone up in that evidence room on the 17th floor.
Bob, it is so rare to get such a terrific panel. I mean, I'm not blowing our own trumpets, but it's true, believe me. So I have a question for our panelists, if you don't mind me. Everybody believes in the Beatles made me do it motive. Now, the lyrics of the Beatles, Helter Skelter, the White Album, Charlie said there was going to be a race riot. He wanted to kickstart the race riot by these murders. I don't believe that, and I'd like to ask...
I don't either.
Okay, well, let me just suggest something. Was the murders, or did the murders take place to cover up for Bobby Beausoleil, who was in prison for the murder of Gary Hinman, facing the death penalty?
I think it was twofold. I think that Charlie was really ticked off at Terry Melcher, and he knew that Terry Melcher had lived up at the Tate House, and he wanted to put the fear of God in him. But I think the primary reason for the murders was to take attention away from Bobby Beausoleil, so they would think that the killer of Gary Hinman was still on the loose, and they would let Beausoleil go. Unfortunately, the Sheriff's Department kept trying to tell LAPD that the murders were connected, and LAPD ignored it, so Beausoleil stayed in jail.
But would Vince Bugliosi, Vince had a terrible problem going with the cover-up for Beausoleil with the jury, and this seemed more convenient?
I think that at some point, Vince did go out to Spahn Ranch, and I think at some point he saw that they had the White Album, which they did. And he talked to them about it, and somehow he put together the idea. We did not know till the day of his opening statement that he was going to claim that the Beatles song was behind this. I mean, it was a huge headline. It was a great way to get a headline worldwide. The Beatles inspired the killings, but I never believed they did.
Ira, I blame you. I blame you
Not only do you blame me for the Beatles, you blame me for being English.
No, I blame you for the motive, because Five to Die came out right before the trial started, and you had all that stuff.
Well, you know, I must tell you, Five to Die, and I was in court.
That was Ivor's first book.
Was my quickie, fast English journalist sensational book, which came out, but it did have some good stuff in there. And Aaron Stovitz, who, as most of you know, was the original trial boss until he opened his mouth and got kicked off, and Vince became king of the Manson murders. And he read the book, and he saw the Beatles made me do it in that 1970 book. And Aaron Stovitz said he used, it sounds self-serving, but Aaron told me that Vince said, hey, let's go with this.
Yeah.
I mean, crazy, I know.
I'm sure that was it.
No, I believe you.
Yeah. The one thing that got us through was gallows humor.
Yes.
Everybody. During that trial, we had a Halloween party. in which everybody came dressed as people from the Manson trial.
Except for Vincent, he came dressed as the prosecutor.
Yeah. But there were things that I remember that when we get together, because we get together with Mary and anybody else that's left from those days, and we remember the funny stories. Irving Kinnaird was weird, and if you get Ivra's book, you can read about the lawyers who were. The whole thing was like, it was just crazy. When you talk about a circus, that was it. You had the girls camped on the sidewalk outside saying they were going to immolate themselves if Charlie was convicted. You had people coming into the courtroom that were having LSD flashbacks. And one day, when Bugliosi was finishing, Irving Kinnaird was finishing his summation, which lasted 2 weeks, a woman who had been on the sidewalk drawing pictures of Manson as Jesus, she came into the courtroom for the first time, and she arose in the spectator section suddenly and announced, "I am the whore of Babylon. I have come to save my brother Manson." And she headed for the front well of the courtroom, screaming she was the whore of Babylon. Well, we now had been in this trial for like 10 months. We were half asleep. Kinnaird had been speaking for days and days and days, and was at that point reading the Bible as part of his summation.
He stopped at the Ascension.
Yeah, he claimed that Manson was Jesus. So she's screaming she's the whore of Babylon. I look at Sandy, and she looks at me, and we look at Theo, and we say, well, we guess we have to cover this. And the deputies roused themselves, and the judge woke up and said, "Arrest that woman." So the deputies shrugged, and they got her, they took her out.
She almost got to the rail.
Yeah.
Before the judge woke
Before
up and
everybody
said,
woke
"Arrest
up."
them."
Yeah, and so we go out in the hallway and call our offices and say there's been another crazy episode, and we're waiting for them to come back. The deputies finally come back, and I said, "So deputies, what did you find out about her?" And they said, "Well, we called the Babylon PD, but there was no rap sheet."
Next up in Part 3, our final part, questions and comments from our audience. Please view Part 3.